Good afternoon, everybody. And this, again, just like Jody was talking about, I've been honored to have a chance to come and talk to multiple groups. And this is one of my more enjoyable parts of what I get to do is come in and share wealth of knowledge and information with all of our persons affected by Parkinson's and of course their caregivers. But we brought all of us down here for a reason. So please feel free to ask questions, interrupt, clarify. And the whole point of this is to be interactive. So don't hesitate to kind of raise your hands and we'll talk through whatever questions you guys have. Again, the focus of today's talk is really on the treatment, and we're going to hammer for most of it is going to be on the pharmacological or medication-based treatment of Parkinson's disease, kind of going through some of the basics about why it all works and what are the different possible options for you. But definitely feel free to ask other questions that relate to any possible treatments. And at the end, we'll talk a little bit potentially in a more overview about other types of treatment, like surgical treatments, and at least in kind of a brief, short overview point of view. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. This is pretty much everything we just talked about. And so to kind of outlay us and kind of orient us to where we're talking about and how all these medications really come into play, what we're looking at here is a kind of a intersection of our brain, and these bigger structures in orange here are basal ganglia. And within these basal ganglia, that's where the dysfunction of Parkinson's really occurs. So we kind of really boil it down to how our nerve cells actually work and interact with each other. Here's those kind of two ends of two nerve cells or neurons talking to each other. And how they kind of do that is they kind of spit out chemical messengers called neurotransmitters from one cell to another cell. And that delivers that kind of electrical signal, that electrical message that helps our cells communicate. And so this will become important to understand why our medications work and where do they work and how they can work together. So we'll come back to this in a little bit. So just to kind of briefly overview some of the basics of Parkinson's disease, it goes all the way back into the early 1800s when Dr. Parkinson first kind of recognized that several of his patients having these predictable symptoms, including his essay on shaking palsies. And then over the years, we kind of learned quite a few things about the pathology of the disease. The first is that we lose these cells, these kind of dark stained cells called the substantia nigra. And you can see down here in the Parkinson's brain, those are the cells that preferentially die off and lead to the symptoms of the disease. And if you actually go back in terms of the pharmacological treatment, that goes all the way back into the 1950s, where we discovered that dopamine was that neurotransmitter, that neurochemical messenger that was a deficit in Parkinson's brains. And so we've actually been treating with the gold standard of treatment since the 1960s, levodopa. So what does that tell us? We know a lot about it. So we know kind of all the ins and outs of levodopa, and it still works pretty well overall. It's still the hallmark or core feature of management of Parkinson's disease. So to kind of talk a little bit about the different pathways that dopamine gets used in the brain, again, it's not just in the motor pathways that we see in Parkinson's. Dopamine has other places that it also works. And that becomes important to understand some of the potential side effects of our medications as we try to kind of solve the dopamine problem. But down here, this is that nigrostriatal pathway. This is the one that is absent or damaged or abnormal in patients suffering from Parkinson's disease. So just to kind of remind us a little bit about Parkinson's, again, the point of this talk is not to delve into the details. What we're really going to focus on here today is kind of on these motor symptoms, our tremors, our bradykinesia, our rigidity or stiffness, and then our impaired balance or walking troubles. As you can see, there's a whole host of other non-motor symptoms that also could potentially have treatments. And the other thing I like to highlight over here, these are not guarantees. These are not will happen, these could happen. And so it's important to kind of ask yourselves and talk with your providers if you have some of these, because oftentimes, either through pharmacological means or through non-pharmacological means, we can help improve those symptoms as they relate to Parkinson's. But again, here's what we're really kind of focusing on for today's purposes in terms of how these medications can help improve the motor function for our patients suffering from the disease. So kind of the first obvious question that we all kind of ask ourselves, well, if the problem is a lack of dopamine, why can't we just take more dopamine? And that comes down to one crucial issue within our brains here, and that's what's called the blood-brain barrier. And so essentially dopamine and pretty much any other neurotransmitters in our brain, they're really tightly regulated to make sure that crosstalk, that communication from cell to cell is very specific and not just flooded in with all a bunch of other chemicals that don't really belong. And so you can't just get dopamine straight through the brain. It's blocked out. It won't cross in from the blood into the brain. So that's why we had to get a little bit clever to figure out, well, how do we kind of work around this? And so what they did is, you can see dopamine here, and they followed it upstream. If any of you have nightmares from your organic chemistry classes from however long ago, yeah, we have some nightmares from that. And then again, what they found is a precursor to make how our bodies make dopamine called L-dopa or levodopa. And that can freely cross through the blood-brain barrier and get picked up in the nerve cells. And then the nerve cells can convert that levodopa into dopamine for us and use that to kind of replace its deficit to kind of increase its message. So that was kind of that big discovery back in the 1960s. And the movie with Robin Williams called Awakenings actually describes that, if you guys are interested in kind of the Hollywood version of that. And there's a whole host of other medications that we'll come back to that really help us kind of solve that primary journey of getting levodopa from our blood, from our gut actually, into our blood and up to the brain, where it can kind of replace that, what's lost from the suffering of Parkinson's disease. So here's our kind of theoretical treatment options. Again, based upon that primary issue of you have a lack of dopamine. Well, we can replace it, try to kind of replace the deficit. We could try to kind of develop a message similar, mimic what dopamine does in the brain. We could try to keep whatever dopamine's around longer, so prevent its natural breakdown, kind of exert more of an effect for every little bit that we have. We could try to protect ourselves from dying, because that's the primary issue, is like, can we stop that loss of cells as it continues to have the disease? We could try to regrow those cells that are lost, or we could try to kind of find a workaround. Can we modify the other existing circuitry to kind of find some backdoor ways of improving that cell-to-cell communication? And so, again, all these are potentially theoretical, but most of the focus is going to be on these top three right here. These are really kind of more theoretical, and then we'll circle back to this at the end as well. So here's kind of just to show you a kind of abbreviated list of all the different possibilities that we have. I'd like to start with this because, again, we have a lot of potential choices of things that can help. And so this is where we kind of spend a lot of time, us as movement disorder experts, is thinking, what about this a la carte menu? Which one of these could potentially be useful for you? So let's kind of delve into the details, shall we? And again, we're going to come back to our cell-to-cell communication here, focusing on the neurons and how they work. And here's kind of a cartoon version of that. And so we have basically kind of three different spots that we can kind of intervene within that cell-to-cell communication. We can come to like the presynaptic neuron, which is the one that's producing the dopamine. These are the ones that are kind of dying off in the cell. And so we can intervene there by giving them back more dopamine. We can intervene in that cell-to-cell communication piece over here, kind of in the middle, by improving and preventing that breakdown. Or we can go to the postsynaptic neuron and basically try to mimic that message. So skip all this, kind of jump straight to the punchline postsynaptically. So we can intervene on the beginning, the middle, or the end. And that's why sometimes it makes sense actually to be on multiple medications to treat this. Because synergistically, if you kind of have one that works here, one that works here, one that works here, they can all kind of work together at all those different points to kind of improve that cell-to-cell communication. So again, we kind of talked a little bit here about where the medications work, and it's kind of the same thing that we talked about here, kind of broken down into the more description, where you can see this presynaptic neuron again here with levodopa working in the middle in the synapse here, or kind of working at the postsynapse or at the end here down over here. So that's kind of a different way of looking at that same outline. So now let's kind of put it into layman's terms. And the way that I kind of like to conceptually think about this is think about our newspaper system, newspaper delivery. I know that might be coming like almost completely extinct in the near future here, but hopefully many of us have had this experience in our lives. And naturally, we kind of have our cell-to-cell communication over here. We have our newspaper boys, and our Parkinson's disease is taking those newspaper boys out. So now there's less of that workforce to deliver that message. That dopamine newspaper is not making it into the mailbox. And to kind of introduce our characters here, we have our newspaper thieves, and we have our dogs that will certainly scare or chew up the newspapers, the natural enemies of getting the newspaper boy to be able to deliver that newspaper. So here's our primary problem in Parkinson's. We've lost newspaper delivery boys. So what can we potentially do? Well, we can give more, whoever's left, let's give them more. Let's give them longer routes, let's give them more papers so that, again, we can increase their output to be able to kind of make up for the loss of the other delivery boys. So you can kind of increase that levodopa that gets converted back into the dopamine, and then we can kind of increase that message. Or we can mimic dopamine. So something that's kind of similar to a newspaper, but kind of delivered through the mail, not by newspaper boys. Well, those are your magazines. So the magazines might deliver roughly the same information as a newspaper, but it's going through a different delivery route. So again, the newspaper or the mailman can deliver that message and get it into the mailbox over here. And our mailmen are experts. They know how to dodge all these guys. They know better. They're not the fresh newspaper boys who kind of can't dodge all those. So they know how to deliver that message straight to the source. Or we can kind of prevent the breakdown, or prevent the breakdown, excuse me, or we can kind of eliminate our natural enemies. We can bring our treats for the dogs or make sure they're chained up. We can make sure that the thieves are out there, you know, and basically allow whatever message is, guarantee that message kind of makes it to the endpoint. So it can exert more of a whole deal. So that's kind of another way to kind of think about that kind of beginning, middle, and end that we can kind of do. Again, we can replace it, give whatever cells are left. We can give more dopamine. We can kind of eliminate the natural enemies, so kind of allow the dopamine to be more efficient to deliver its message. Or we can bypass and use a system that kind of looks and seems very similar to dopamine, delivers a roughly similar message. We kind of skip straight to the endpoint. So now kind of focusing on what levodopa does. What are the things that it can and can't do? So the things that it really has a consistent benefit. So the vast majority of patients will see that improvement in their slowness or their bradykinesia and improvement in their stiffness. That's the most reliable response they're going to have. Now, variable benefit can be for the gait instability or the freezing of gait issues. A lot of patients will, but some won't. Or some might have kind of less of a response comparatively to these other symptoms. So one thing I like to highlight here is, in addition to the tremors, both of these might respond. So if you're started on a medication, it's really important to understand, working with your providers or your prescribers of your medications, what am I looking for? What is the benefit I'm trying to get? Because there's kind of two questions with that. Of course, your primary goal, the thing that bothers me is my tremors. I want to be on a medication that improves my tremors. But diagnostically, this can help too. It can help us know that, hey, if you're responding to levodopa, that helps us kind of focus on Parkinson's disease and avoid some of the other mimics. So sometimes paying attention to these other more consistent symptoms is equally important diagnostically for your physicians too. So the point is, whenever I start a patient on levodopa, certainly if these are the priority, I'm still going to spend time focusing on, are these getting better too? Because we can learn a little bit about your disease by doing that as well. So try to kind of look at the big picture of all the things that could benefit. The other thing down here is that many patients will have improvement in some of those non-motor functions, but it's kind of a bonus. It's not a guarantee. For example, many patients might have a decrease in urinary incontinence or urinary frequency, but we can't guarantee that with it. It's nice when it happens, but there's some things that are more direct to that as well. But these are kind of the big two. And again, these are more variable. And so tremors, 40% to 40% of the time, might not respond to medications. And that's why we have other treatments to help in that situation. So what are the common side effects? What are the things you have to worry about now that we heard about what it can do? The big one over here, the most common one by far, is an upset stomach. Now, the good news with this is that it's almost always transient. Over 90 to 95% of the time, that goes away. So once your body gets used to it after the first few weeks or so, it doesn't come back. There's certainly some unlucky few people. We'll talk a little bit about what we can do in that case. But the most important thing at the start is being aware of this. So you make sure you take your medication with food and other things that we'll talk about in a little bit. The other thing can be dizziness when changing positions. So it's not going to be that when you're sitting there and you check your blood pressure comes back low. But when you've been sitting all down like you guys are now, and you go to stand up to walk all the way down to the bathroom, then you're going to feel that kind of dizziness wave kind of hit you. Or what most patients actually experience with this is that it doesn't actually make you kind of really lightheaded, dizzy, like you feel like you're about to faint. But you don't feel good when you're standing up because that blood pressure never kind of corrects itself. So you describe that as fatigue. You describe that as I can't exercise, I have exercise intolerance. And that could be because of the disease combining with the levodopa effect. So something to be aware of. And then it can also cause vivid dreams. Honestly, they're dreams. Yeah, so most patients kind of shrug those off as like, well, that was kind of bizarre. But certainly it can sometimes kind of make that more of a problem, and depending on what you're dreaming about. And then the rare ones, these ones will happen very rarely, especially for most of you guys in kind of the early course of the disease. These are usually coming later, but can be more bothersome. The dyskinesias, which again, if any of you guys have seen Michael J. Fox recently, those are those kind of hyperkinetic movements, those fidgety movements, like you can't sit still, or hallucinations, seeing things that aren't actually there. That can all be made worse or caused by levodopa. So these are the things we're kind of on the lookout for. What's beautiful about everything on this slide, 100% reversible. You're not stuck with any of these. So if you ever develop problems, you can get rid of them too. So let's talk about let's be some, put on our myth busting hats over here, because there's a lot of things that kind of exist over the years. Again, we've had this medication since the 1960s. That's many decades of also building up a lot of myths about the medication. And to be honest with you, a lot of things that we thought back in the 60s and 70s and 80s that we've now been able to disprove. Why? Because we've had 60 years of experience with this medication. So we've kind of eliminated a lot of myths over time. The first one is that it can cause symptoms to get worse over time, or it becomes toxic. And once you start it, it kind of accelerates the disease. It does not affect the disease at all in terms of the progression. So that's the good news. Yeah, it doesn't become more toxic. It also doesn't slow down disease progression either. So it's there to provide symptomatic benefit. It's not there to slow down the disease. The other thing is that it has a shelf life, meaning that as soon as you break the seal on it, as soon as you start using it, you only have so much time before it stops working. We know that that is not true. Why? Because we've had patients on it for 40, 50, 60 years, and it still works. So the idea there is what we were seeing is that the disease progresses. So certainly the response you get doesn't look quite as good as it might do at the start, but vice versa, there's no reason to wait until you're miserable to use a medication that keeps you from feeling miserable. The whole point is taking it while you feel good, while you're active, while you're able to live a relatively normal life. That's where these medications really pay a dividend. So there's no reason to leave it on a shelf. It's going to work for as long as you take it, and nothing happens. There's no consequence of taking it further. The other thing that we kind of hear a lot about is that levodopa, or just kind of in general, the fear about taking artificial chemicals. Levodopa is found in nature. You know, there's actually concentrated products that don't really work very well, because we'll talk a little bit about their inefficiency. But again, this is a natural compound that's kind of concentrated into the medication for you. And the other thing that we hear a lot about is that it can cause dyskinesias, and we'll talk about this on the next slide. But again, we've been able to bust all of these. So dyskinesias. So this was originally thought that one reason why you may want to hold off on using it is because as soon as you start, you kind of turn the clock on getting those dyskinesias. What this study kind of showed us is that's not true. So there's kind of two cohorts of patients they compared that started and kind of into the study at the same time. One was a group of Italian patients, and one was a group in Ghana, country in the Cape of Africa. And so essentially this group had really good access to medical care and got access to medicine early. This group didn't. So in this group, you can see they started levodopa right over here, and it took all these years before they started getting dyskinesias. So about 3 years or so on average before they started getting dyskinesias. This group that waited until basically 6 years to start on levodopa, within that same year, they started getting dyskinesias. So what did that tell us? The dyskinesias were coming as a matter of how long you have the disease, not how long you've been on the medication. Okay. So again, this group enjoyed that 3 years of bliss where they didn't have to worry about those dyskinesias. And again, no matter what, unfortunately, that risk does come down the line, and then you manage it accordingly. So again, just another plug to say there's no reason to wait. There's no reason to hold off because it could accelerate the side effects. Again, this is where you want to be on it, right? To begin that kind of honeymoon period where you don't have to worry about some of that. I don't know if this video will work. Oh, no, probably won't. But again, this is just Michael J. Fox showing those dyskinesias. So levodopa has a lot of formulations to it. And why? Because it works. It's still the gold standard. And its biggest problem is trying to keep it around long enough so it can kind of have a steady effect, kind of bathe the brain and keep that kind of constant supply. So that's what all these formulations have tried to kind of do over the years, is really, we know levodopa when it gets to the brain works. How do we get that supply to the brain in all the different manifestations? So you'll see a lot of nomenclatures about immediate release, controlled release, extended release. There's one that actually just got released like within like I think last week or maybe even next week. Kind of the newest extended release levodopa. There's some that come in combination with other medications, some that get used as kind of like an immediate release, kind of rescue dose, like I need it to work in 5 minutes. There's some that kind of do a slow, steady release, like through a feeding tube. And then there's even other doses that kind of break it down and make it easier to cut them in half. You know, there's been a lot of formulations out there. Basically, all of these are combined with carbidopa. And what is carbidopa doing? It's designed to prevent the breakdown of levodopa outside the brain. So a lot of you might be familiar with this term Sinemet, which is kind of the trade name of it, which for any Latin aficionados means sin without, emesis, vomiting. So they literally name the drug without vomiting. And that's because taking levodopa by itself causes a lot of breakdown in the gut, and then the breakdown in the gut causes the upset stomach. So since carbidopa prevents that breakdown until it gets to the brain, it really reduces the ad nauseum vomiting side effects. So when they made it, that's why they named it without vomiting. So again, in nature, you can find these mucuna pruriens products, which is basically natural occurring levodopa. But since it doesn't have carbidopa associated with it, it's pretty volatile. It's actually way more expensive to basically get to the dose, because you have to do 100, if not 1,000-fold increase of the amount of levodopa, knowing that a lot of it's going to get chewed up before it makes to the brain if you don't have the carbidopa with it. So just to kind of like put that into perspective, yeah, for what, if you kind of see those different products, why is it potentially better using medication? Because it's more reliable. You're going to get a more reliable payload to the brain. Even in a perfect world with carbidopa, we only get about 10% of levodopa to the brain. So if you kind of even sacrifice a little bit of that, we're talking about a huge potential difference in terms of the benefit you could see. Is if you lose 1%, that's already 10% of your benefit right there. So this is kind of just another kind of view of it. The old yellow tabs are your immediate release, and that's kind of like the usual one we use because it's the easiest to kind of manipulate and kind of get into the sweet spot. You'll see many different versions of these kind of controlled release, sustained action, ER, all meaning the same thing. The carbidopa, levodopa combined with a drug called entacapone called Stalevo. And then you can see the Rytari, which is these capsules here with kind of microbeads of immediate release and extended release kind of mixed together. So you might kind of see many of these different formulations of levodopa. And really, why would we choose these and why are there other formulations? Because here's our issue with Parkinson's. Hopefully many of you are still here early in the disease where this is like the drug curve, like this is the amount of drug you have in your brain. And if you stay in the green, green is good. But as the disease progresses, you need more because more cells die. So you need more to kind of get into the sweet spot. But it also becomes easier to overwhelm the system and get those side effects as well, like dyskinesias, for example. And then that window, unfortunately, narrows on both sides. So you can see if you just kind of take the same drug, eventually you're going to have to adjust it to keep it in that sweet spot. So let's kind of take a look at the different formulations about why we would maybe potentially choose one versus the other. So over here, we have our kind of our curve. And what we're seeing here is this is the concentration of a levodopa in our bodies. And this is time. So it kind of, as you take the pill, it kicks in about a half an hour, and then it'll slowly wear off over here. So these squares, this is your immediate release levodopa. So there's that nice kick in, half an hour, it gets up to its peak. And then here's our kind of relative therapeutic window, that green area, that good spot. And then you can see at about 4 to 6 hours, that's when it starts to kind of leave that window. So hence, 3 times a day, it works for about 4 to 6 hours. And before it eventually kind of leaves our system. Here's where it gets a little bit tricky, because when you hear controlled release, sustained action, extended release, even most seasoned physicians, when we hear that, we think lasts longer in the body. Turns out that's not the case. It takes longer to kick in. So you can kind of, we'll get the controlled release. Here's its peak. So you can see that difference here. So it takes longer to kick in. So it's a sustained release. It takes longer to get in. So by the time it's getting in, it's already wearing off. And you can see it wears off at the exact same time. So the CR, SA, ER, Cinemet ER, all those kinds of formulations last in the same amount as the IR versions, the immediate release versions. So that's something that unfortunately was kind of a swing and a miss when they made it. And you can see that, so again, wears off at the same time. Now, there might be instances where we might still use these to take advantage of that slow kick in. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But again, it is not a twice-a-day medication. It does not last longer than the immediate release. It's still going to wear off at the same time. And then we have kind of the Rytari, and here's your immediate release kick. This is the one that's that combination. It's a combination of immediate release and extended release. And you can see now we're actually kind of moving the needle a little bit in terms of getting that medication to last long in your system. So right now, as of like this week, maybe next week, we'll have the newest version, the Crexon, which is the brand new version of kind of the Rytari 2.0, the extended release levodopa. But again, that's the only one that's so far available to actually kind of extend that half-life. Why would we not just go straight to Rytari? Very fair question, cost. It's much more expensive, and almost no insurance companies will cover it unless you try and fail these medications. So we usually only go to it when you start having problems. What's the good news? Especially in the early disease course, this stuff works great. So you don't really need all the kind of other bells and whistles until you get into those more advanced points, and until you're really kind of getting to that kind of later stage of the disease, over here. This is when we need that kind of more precise mechanism. Over here, a lot of stuff works. So that's why the good news is the cheap stuff works. So that's a little bit of the breakdown. And then the only other thing that's on here too is you see the entacapone. That's the other one that we'll come back to in a little bit. This one right here kind of helps extend that half-life. That entacapone helps prevent that breakdown and extend the half-life on it as well.
So other than the natural breakdown of the dopamine, is there anything that we do, whether we use activity or
Nope.
eating, that
Nope.
accelerates it?
Very fair question, no. Where it can kind of come into, go ahead, Jim.
Question, please.
Yeah, so he's asking, is there any, is just eating or exercise or anything kind of prevent the, or accelerate the breakdown of levodopa? No. A lot of patients have that misnomer, and it's because, yes, if you increase the demand on your body, you're gonna notice if you weren't quite in the sweet spot. So that
Right.
sometimes can kind of convince you. But the only thing is sometimes if there's food, that could be a little bit of a different issue, especially with the extended release preparations that are kind of hanging out in your stomach. And that can definitely impact that. And we'll come back to that in a little bit more detail. So we'll skip this one because, to be honest with you, the whole thing about this is that it just basically the tab breaks off more easily. So just be aware in case you're having to cut your pills in half and having a real hard time. There potentially is this available out there. You can kind of get one that kind of breaks down into tabs more. But as mentioned, we'll talk about the interaction with food. So essentially, what are we doing? Pill gets dissolved in our stomachs, and it has to pass into our gut, into our small intestine before it gets absorbed. So no matter what you do, it's got to get through the stomach, into your small intestine, then it gets into the bloodstream and ultimately into the brain. Just like you are familiar with Tylenol, Motrin, and Aleve, and all these other medications we might take. Why do they all take about a half an hour? Because they work that same way. They get dissolved in the stomach, into the small intestine, into the blood. That takes about a half an hour or so to do that. What's interesting is that levodopa, as those neurotransmitters, they're basically made out of other proteins. Our body uses proteins for a lot of things in our bodies, and including neurotransmitters are very closely related. So the building blocks of proteins are called amino acids. And you guys maybe remember that even going back to grade school about those healthy, those essential amino acids and everything they tell us in our diets. These are our building blocks that we kind of that our body puts together to make neurotransmitters like dopamine or a lot of other chemicals in our body. And so essentially, we have kind of a nondescript delivery system for those amino acids. It's not specific to levodopa, dopamine, it takes them all. So if you have a big block of protein that you're taking into your stomach's job is to dissolve all that into the amino acids. And then that nondescript carrier will pick all those amino acids up together and pull them into the bloodstream. So if you try to flood the system all at once with your levodopa medication, plus a bunch of other amino acids from your diet, not as much of that levodopa is going to be able to get in. So that's where that kind of issue can occur. I do want to comment though, we're talking maybe up to 30% decrease. Because I have a lot of patients that actually overreact to this. In a perfect world, you want to get the levodopa separated from any protein load. Not food in general, protein specifically. But not the end of the world if it does, because all you're going to do is decrease by maybe up to 30%. So certainly on an everyday basis, maybe not something you're trying to do, but yeah, life happens. It's better to have 70% of your drug than 0. Okay. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So what can you do? Early on, when nausea is more likely to occur, make sure you take it with the meals and snacks. Don't jump straight to empty stomach yet, because that's when that nausea is going to hit you those first few weeks. In a perfect world, if you use carbohydrate snacks, like your bread products, or honestly things that don't have a lot of protein, think fruits, vegetables, most of these things, perfectly fine. You want to stay away from things that have a lot of protein if possible. But at the start, don't worry so much about it. That can be something that as you kind of build up that tolerance and you're out of that window for the nausea, and then you can start moving and taking the pills on an empty stomach. So especially if any of you get an upset stomach from taking the pills, make sure you got something in the belly, at least a carbohydrate snack with a cracker or something at best. Once you kind of get into that best practice, usually about 30 minutes before a meal or about 1 to 2 hours after is not a bad way to kind of get into that groove, into that routine. So if you kind of get into that good schedule day to day where you're like, I take my pills and then I have my meal about a half an hour later, that works decently well to kind of avoid any interactions. Then you don't have to worry about like, what am I eating or all those kinds of things. You just kind of get into that habit. The trick part though is like sometimes with those extended release medications, like the Rytari, for example, that could be sitting in your stomach for hours. So then it really doesn't necessarily matter when you eat. And the whole point there is try not to worry about it. And again, you can, as long as you have generally a routine and roughly most of the same, the day after day, you kind of roughly eat and kind of roughly take your meds at the same time, you can adjust your dose accordingly to account for anything that gets messed up by the food. Okay. Questions about this? Yeah.
Is there a way to measure the level of levodopa in the bloodstream?
So he's asking, is there a way to measure levodopa in the bloodstream? And the answer is no, can't do it. No. So there's no good way. The only way that we can really measure the effectiveness is with control of your symptoms. And for many of you in the early stages of the disease, when you're in that kind of big green box, why does everything work? Because you still have enough cells left and you have some storage capacity. So your brain can kind of smooth out those gaps from the medications not in your system. As the disease progresses, you lose that, and we're going to come back to that point because I think it's a key point to understand what early stage versus advanced stage Parkinson's is. What's kind of a short version of advanced stage when you can't get away with doing anything anymore. You have to be more precise because as soon as that medication leaves the body and leaves the brain, now you're losing function as a result of that. And that's how we can tell kind of what your levels are in your blood or your brain is how well your symptoms are controlled. Mm-hmm. But again, the big thing here, the big takeaway, remember, if it's like, oh shoot, I'm due for my pill, if I just ate, take it. Don't wait 2 hours, then just take it on an empty stomach. Because 0% is way worse than 7%. Okay. The idea is like, hey, in a perfect world, I set a routine. I eat lunch every day at noon. So I take my pill at 11:30. Or vice versa, depending on how you're. So most days you get it right. Not every life happens, and that's okay. And some other practical points, and these are things that, especially if you guys haven't started the medication or have maybe not thought about why we do what we do. We usually like to start with the immediate release. Again, it's just the easiest one to use. It has a nice kick in, so you don't have to wait for it to kind of kick in. And again, it's more predictable in terms of responsiveness. And again, we just talked about why it's 3 times a day. At the start, it's easy, breakfast, lunch, dinner. You take it with your meals. But eventually, as you kind of move it away from meals, the idea is you want to think to yourself, well, if I'm taking it every 8 hours, I ain't going to do it. Ain't going to make it. It only lasts about 4 to 5 hours in our bodies. Okay. And again, we already talked a little bit about the food issue. And again, make sure we talk about our carbohydrates next. One more reminder for that. So what are some of the other alternatives? Again, so some of our patients, especially my patients that are over 90 because of how their bodies and their blood pressure systems work, our blood vessels kind of lose their elasticity over time. And anytime we stand up, it kind of squeezes down for us to keep the blood in our brain. But if you guys ever left a rubber band out in the sun for too long, it's kind of the same thing that happens to our blood vessels. They lose the ability to squeeze. And so you're much more vulnerable to those blood pressure effects as you get older. So one thing that we can kind of do is take advantage of that slower release, because that quick release can kind of help drop the blood pressure when you stand up even quicker. And so a lot of patients, when they take it, they'll feel like a half an hour later, I have to go lay down. Half an hour later, I'm falling asleep. And that's because of that blood pressure effect. So you can actually use the kind of the slower release medications like the CRs to take advantage of that so it doesn't hit you quite as hard, to slower absorption peaks. So that's one example of where you might kind of choose those other formulations. So very personalized approach depending on what your issues are. And then on occasion, patients will have an issue with the yellow dye. And so we do have other formulations that we can use to work around that. It's not an allergic reaction to the levodopa, it's what the coloring they use to make the pill. So again, some alternative drug delivery ways so that you try to bypass the gut. How can we kind of work around that issue? Well, one is the inhaled version, which goes straight into the lungs and then straight into the bloodstream. This is quick on, quick off. So this is great when you're off periods, when your medications wash out of you, they lose function. Or they become unpredictable, where like, I don't know when it's going to hit me, but when I do, I can't walk. Or when I do, I can't be able to do what I need to do to function. So I need something, I can't wait a half an hour for my next dose to kick in. I need something that's going to work within a few minutes. That's what this can do. But again, it wears off by an hour. So it doesn't replace your baseline regimen, your oral regimen that can last several hours. This one's out of your system, and hopefully it buys you that bridge until your next dose is kicked in. So this is usually more later in the disease course when you start developing those off periods where you lose that function. Yeah, so that's when we kind of use this one. The other thing that we can do, this is already available, is that we can actually put it through your feeding tube and hook it up to a little pump over here. And so essentially this delivers a steady concentration of levodopa straight into your gut where it can get absorbed throughout the day. So why are people not doing this? I mean, is anyone super excited about walking around with a feeding tube? No hands? Okay. And that's kind of the big thing on this one. Usually that it has to become problematic enough in your life that it's like, yeah, give me the feeding tube, I'll deal with that. And the feeding tube is kind of, you can live pretty normally. You can swim, you can kind of do whatever you want to do with it. But again, rightfully so, I think most people aren't like, well, if I can take a pill versus having a tube, I'll wait until the pills don't work for me before I can sign up for that. And again, the other big thing too is that you will have complications dealing with it. It gets kinked, gets clogged, so it's a little bit more maintenance, but especially if you're riding the roller coaster with the medications throughout the day, this can be a nice way to kind of salvage that situation. This is already commercially available. What's potentially coming soon, and it's sitting on the FDA's desk right now as we speak, is basically a skin patch. So you basically have the same concept of that steady state absorption, and kind of getting a steady amount coming in throughout the day, but you avoid the issues of having to feed. So stay tuned, that could be available to us soon. Yeah. And again, what you would do is kind of, you can kind of see the cartoon here where you kind of wear it on your belt like a diabetes pump. If anyone's seen like a type 1 diabetic, that's kind of the same technology we're talking about here. That kind of steady infusion to, again, not have that peak and valley, but kind of a nice steady amount. And especially when we show when that window narrows, this is a nice way to combat that, where you can kind of really set it in that narrow window so it doesn't get those too much or too little. And another nice way to potentially kind of dodge the gut, right? Where we can actually kind of work around the gut if people have problems with their guts.
So it's available in the pump, not a straight patch.
It's available through the feeding tube and it's not available through the patch yet.
Okay.
They both have pumps, but it's what it's hooked up to. One pump is hooked up to the feeding tube.
Right.
The other one's hooked up to the skin patch, yeah. And that one's potentially, hopefully, to be available soon. So that was replacing dopamine. That's all levodopa. And again, that's the big part of what we talk about because it's the gold standard. It's what's going to be the backbone of your treatment. Everything else, the rest of what we kind of talk about is like, well, what can we do to kind of get close to how good levodopa is or help kind of work along synergistically with levodopa, okay? So the next one is our mimic dopamines. These are our magazines, right? So getting into that, these are what we call the dopamine agonists. And you can see there's kind of like 4 commercially available ones that are out there, and those are the individual names that you might see. And they all kind of basically work the same way. The actual advantages is that you do have different types. So there's pills, there's extended release, kind of once daily pills. There's also a patch version. There's even like an injectable version if you need that kind of quick action like we just talked about for the inhaled version. And so you've got a lot more options compared to levodopa potentially to kind of work with whatever your schedule is. The other nice thing too, we'll take a look at this in a different way, it is less likely to cause dyskinesias, less interference with the diet and protein. And again, we can sometimes make it simpler for you. So what are the downsides? The downsides, for the most part, those side effects that we talked about for levodopa, these can do it too. So all like the dizziness, the upset stomach, all the hallucinations, all those kinds of things are very similar with the exception of the dyskinesias. But it has some other additional ones that it does a little bit more prominently than levodopa does. And probably it can cause some leg swelling and other things. But the big two, the ones that we kind of run into the most problems with, it can cause sleep attacks. It's almost kind of like looking like a narcoleptic attack. It's not quite that severe, but you can kind of fall asleep suddenly, which is obviously a problem if you're driving or doing other things. But the big one is these impulse control disorders. And you can see kind of a cartoon version of this, of kind of showing the different things that can happen. And remember, I think I have it in here, we talked about these different pathways in the brain. So these other pathways that come up here, this is your reward pathway. And your reward pathway uses dopamine. That's kind of the colloquialism, the thing that you hear amongst like the Gen Xers and Gen Zers about, oh, you got to get your dopamine dumped or whatever it might be. That's what they're talking about, stimulation of this reward pathway. Cocaine and other drugs, that's part of the way why they work and cause addiction. So again, if you're using a mimic, it's going everywhere in the brain. It's target bombing all those different potential receptors. It does not care where there's a deficit. When you use levodopa, it's only getting picked up by those cells that are starving to make more dopamine. Those signals are saying, please, we need more dopamine here. So it's preferentially going into these pathways, but these pathways are already full up with their dopamine. Like, now we're good. Keep on going down the road. We already got our newspaper. We don't need another one. These ones don't care. They're going to be all spamming your mailbox with whatever message they can get to you. So that's why the dopamine agonists in particular will cause these impulse control disorders. So that can be anything from like hypersexuality, buying prostitutes, to spending money on the online girlfriends. I had one person whose family members caught him as he was loading his truck with all his valuables to send to his imaginary girlfriend to get her out of Nigeria. I've had other patients spend thousands of dollars on those Candy Crush games, where it's like, yeah, I want more gems, of course I do. So again, a lot of these impulsive like behaviors that can become problematic. Compulsive shopping, gambling, all these other things are involved with that too. Now, it's not necessarily always bad, right? Sometimes the actual compulsion is okay. Good example of that is one patient whose compulsion was cleaning their house every night, but they still went to bed on time, they still ate their meals, and the house is clean. So it's kind of like, well, who loses in this situation per se? There's other times like punting behaviors, like I have patients like deep diving on the web till all hours of the night, and they can't put it down. I had one patient that would like reorganize his tool shed every night. And again, he skipped his meals. He stopped going out to social gatherings because he was obsessed with doing this reorganization of his tools. So depending on what it is, it can become extremely problematic to relationships, to finances, all the other things. And here's the catch. The patient themselves, the person on the drug, won't notice it. They're going to think, why not? More gems, more Candy Crush, who loses? And so they don't see it as bad. It's also not uncovering some deep skeleton in their closet. They've had these long desires that are finally coming to the surface. It's all driven by that abnormal stimulation of the reward pathway. So who's going to notice it? The caregivers, the family members, all the other people in the room here today with your loved ones. You're going to be the ones that notice it. So if you if you have anybody that's on these medications or you yourself are ever prescribed these, make sure that you're telling other people around you, hey, watch out. Keep track of this. Share the credit card statements. Make sure, because again, if you catch this and you stop the medication, that desire goes away. And it's so amazing. I have so many stories of patients that will come back afterwards and say, Doc, I can't believe that I did all that. Like I'm now looking back at it, it's like so bizarre that I care about that kind of stuff. And again, it's just kind of that off-site stimulation. And I don't want to scare you too much into saying like never be on this medication, because again, if you're kind of paying attention enough and watching out for it, you can catch it early and get yourself off it. Because it's not a guarantee you will get these, but it can happen. So a lot of times, to be honest with you, this might be one big reason when I bring up this as an option for patients, that they might say, yeah, I don't know if I really want to take the risk on some of those things. Yeah. There's no real data about like, well, I'm an impulsive person at baseline, will this make it worse? Yeah, it doesn't necessarily play by those rules. But again, it's important to be aware of that one in particular, because that's the one that the patients themselves might not catch until it's too late. The other kind of breakdown of this, to kind of like put it into a comparison about why we might choose levodopa versus the dopamine agonist. And levodopa, the risk of dyskinesia is much higher. So for example, if I have younger patients who are going to be, I have one that like does international news broadcasts. And so she's like going to be on, news stations broadcasted across the world. She doesn't want to have dyskinesias. She doesn't want to have someone being like, oh my God, what's wrong with this girl that's talking about these things? So she would obviously probably want to avoid levodopa more than other people. Like, I don't care if I lay it on, it doesn't bother me. And again, the why not dopamine agonists would be those sleep attacks or the impulse control disorders. Roughly though, efficacy wise, they're pretty close to each other. Levodopa works slightly better. Maybe kind of look at the details over here. But for the most part, why we would choose one versus the other has to do with the side effects. Why you might need one versus the other is very individualized approach.
The dopamine agonist, when you stop, will the symptoms go away too, whether reversible?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, the only thing is, like, so he's asking if it's reversible, now we can stop it. But the bottom line is, like, is your bank account reversible? Is it damage to your relationship reversible? That's kind of a $1 question, right? But the actual impulse will stop. And I will say, can this happen with levodopa or just from Parkinson's? Yes, but it's much more rare. With the dopamine agonists, it's much more common. And these were kind of, most of them were developed in the 90s. And it was actually just in the mid-2010 before we put this together. But it's like, wait a minute. This seems to be kind of driving a lot of the abnormal behaviors. So you still will see other providers, especially providers that trained before the 2010s, love these medications. When they came out, they're like, this is the fix to avoid dyskinesias. We solved it. We solved the problem until these other things kind of came through the woodworks. So you might still have a lot of other, you might be prescribing yourselves and other. The important thing is that if you were prescribed and never heard that, hopefully now you have, and that's an important thing to be aware of as a potential side effect. So kind of moving on to the other sites. So we talked a little bit about other medications and the idea about levodopa on its journey up to the brain and avoiding that breakdown. We already talked about carbidopa being the one that kind of carries it out here in the bloodstream. Well, we have another pathway that tries to kill off that dopamine too, called the COMT inhibitors, and another one inside the cell, one that the cells spitting the transmitter back and forth that comes and chews all that up to clean out for the next message, called your MAOB. So these are the other two. That's like your dog on the porch or the newspaper thieves. These are the ones that are trying to chew up that levodopa before it can kind of increase that chemical message in the brain. So let's talk about how to prevent the breakdown of dopamine here. So the COMT inhibitors, probably the most common ones called Comtan, which is entacapone. There are a few others that are available that kind of work very much similarly to it. And the idea here is that you're preventing that breakdown, so allowing more to reach the brain. So this one only works if you take levodopa, because it's not doing anything naturally. It's only if you have that levodopa trying to make its way up, you can stop the breakdown along the way. So you kind of take it together. They do make that combination pill that we already saw a little bit before called Stalevo. And that one is basically, this is put together with the carbidopa levodopa. So that's really the big difference with that. Why you would choose that versus just taking two pills might be cost, depending on what your insurance and other things are. This will kind of maybe decrease that off time and prolong that off time by about 30 to 60 minutes. So it's not a home run hitter. Is it going to kind of move the needle in the right direction? But again, if you're kind of in that window, right, and you're trying to kind of measure between getting too much and too little, this can kind of help kind of fine tune that levodopa effectively. So as opposed to just increasing the levodopa, which would be a much more direct move, but also can much more directly overshoot and cause those side effects. This one can kind of help fine tune and kind of smooth out those edges for you. So if you're kind of close, you're like, no, I'm getting close to my next dose, and I'm wearing off a little bit before, this is where you would probably use it. Some kind of interesting side effects. I mean, mostly it works by increasing levodopa to the brain. So all those side effects we've learned about, that's what this can do too, is essentially just increasing levodopa. But the couple unique things, there are some patients that get diarrhea. Again, for most of you that are suffering from constipation, sometimes it's like, it's not so bad. And then the other part is it can turn your urine orange. So it's certainly a little bit shocking the first few times you see it, but it's harmless. It's just some of the other parts of the medication. It's not causing damage or anything. So as long as you're kind of aware of it, then you don't need to worry about it. So that again, it's not as robust, not a home run hitter. Kind of fine tuning that levodopa to keep it in that sweet spot. That's where you might kind of use it, especially if that levodopa is not making it to the next dose without none. And then we talked about the MAO inhibitors. So these are called resagiline or sledgeling. Resagiline is once a day, sledgeline is twice a day, but basically they kind of work the same way. And again, they're responsible for preventing that breakdown of dopamine in the brain. So interestingly, these can actually be taken alone because your brain is still making dopamine naturally. And this will actually help keep that dopamine around longer, even if you're not taking any levodopa along with it. So you will sometimes have patients or prescribers use these even outside of being on levodopa. Okay. But these are the same kind of deal as the COMT inhibitors, like Comtan. These are not your home run. These are going to maybe help by reducing that off time by the 30 to 60 minutes. Okay. But it's nice. Once a day, twice a day. That's not too hard to do. So sometimes that's one reason why we might use it, because it's not too complex to add it on board. Or again, same thing. You're pretty close. Just a little bit chinks in the armor here and there. And this might be a nice way to kind of patch up those little gaps in how the levodopa is working. One other interesting thing about it is it has some evidence that it can help fatigue. Resagiline has some direct evidence that supports this. Sledgeling actually breaks down into L-amphetamine, not the good stuff you can find on the street, which is D-amphetamine or dextroamphetamine, but it has kind of a similar kind of boost towards fatigue. And for any long truck drivers or anyone that gets screened for drug tests, if you're on sledgeling, you'll screen positive for amphetamines. So it's important to be aware of that if you started on it, because unfortunately, we have some patients find out the hard way. And man, once you get that positive drug test, you can imagine how complicated that can get if you don't get out in front of it. So that's another thing to be aware of if you start these. So on occasion, we might use these if you're like, my symptoms are kind of mildly bothersome, they're not major. I'm willing to take medication once a day to kind of see if it helps. Not ready to sign up for a 3 times a day medication like levodopa, so that's one version. Or levodopa is working, but it's starting to kind of have some cracks in there where I'm not quite making it dose to dose. It'd be nice to have something that kind of smooths me out by the kind of half an hour around each dose. That might be another time we use it. Or certainly as patients that are having a lot of fatigue with their medications, you might try this and see that helps them improve their fatigue. So that's kind of 3 different versions where you might see these get thrown into the mix. In addition, most of it kind of the same side effects as increasing levodopa. So that goes back to that same thing of how it kind of works to kind of enhance the levodopa effect. But the big one is that this one does have some drug-drug interactions. So the big thing is when you're prescribed medications, it's usually not a problem because your providers will be aware of that. But over-the-counter medications, those cough and cold medications, there's plenty that will interact with these. If any of you have ever read all that fine print on your cough and cold medications, and you'll see something in there, do not take with Parkinson's medications. This is what they're talking about. They're not talking about any of the other ones we talked about up to this point. These are the ones they need. So what do you do in that situation? You don't take what your wife or your husband, if they had the cold first last week, you don't grab theirs. You pop into Walgreens, whatever pharmacy you're at, go to the back of the store and say, hey, I'm on Selegiline or I'm on Rastagiline. Which cold medication can I take? And those pharmacists will be happy to tell you one out of those like 50 to 100 different options. They'll pick one that's okay to take. Is it possible to keep a list of all those? No. And if any of you have been to a drugstore recently, you see why, because there's 8 different names for the same thing. So it's impossible to kind of have a list of all those over-the-counter medications. And so don't hesitate. Ask the pharmacist in the back of the store. They'll be able to answer that question, no problem. The other thing is that a lot of things, because this actually happened, it actually happened to me 3 times today. What's weird about how the FDA works in our country is that if you have a medication that gets released that has the same mechanism of action as other medications, it carries the same warning label. Unless you specifically fund a study that compares the new drug directly to the old drug in a study. So you can't be like, our new drug, here's the data, let's compare it to the study that was done 20 years ago on the old drug. That doesn't count. You have to do a new study, which costs millions of dollars to directly say, here's how our medication is different than this old one. And then they'll say, okay, yeah, you don't have the same label as okay. So this is a good example because these MAO inhibitors have been around since the 1950s, antidepressants. They work on another neurotransmitter called serotonin. These ones don't. These ones don't really interact with serotonin at all. They interact with dopamine, which is that MAO-B. MAO-A actually interacts with serotonin, which is pretty much where all your antidepressant medications, pain medications, a lot of those will work in the serotonin syndrome or serotonin system. And so these ones carry that same interaction label to say, do not take an antidepressant with these, otherwise you can get a severe case of what's called serotonin syndrome, which can be harmful or life-threatening. So they actually did a study for this, thousands of patients on these with Parkinson's and taking the antidepressants, 0 cases of serotonin syndrome. 0 out of thousands. It's called the Staccato trial, if any of you guys are interested in looking it up. But again, if you go to the pharmacist, they'll be like, hey, do you know that Dr. Hawkins is trying to kill you by prescribing these 2 medications? Did he tell you about that? And that's because it carries that old label of all the other MAO inhibitors that can be poisonous. Okay? So I just want to kind of reassure you about that. Even sometimes you might have your primary care general practitioners kind of like freak out about those things. It's perfectly okay. When in doubt, if you're not sure, you just reach out to your Parkinson's providers, your neurologist, and ask them, is this one of those drugs we have to worry about, or is this one we don't have to? Because I hate to tell you, unfortunately, that's the way the system works. It's going to flag all of them. And all those pharmacists that work in retail stores, they're trained. When that gets flagged, they read the riot act to you. They're going to read that line for line about how harmful it is. And so I got 3 messages today from pharmacies being like, hey, I just want to let you know that you're trying to kill your patients. So again, I usually get out in front of it to my patients and say, yeah, don't worry about this. I'm aware, not a problem. So now we're kind of like, again, these ones are really theoretical. I hate to tell you, we don't really have great stuff here to protect cells from dying, except exercise. Exercise is the thing that actually protects cells. So that's why it's so crucially important. And I think that's the next talk, right? I think that's the 3rd talk for you guys, right? Yeah. And then regrowing dopaminergic neurons, not yet. Stem cells don't work. And we have study after study that fails and fails and fails. There's new studies that are trying to look at it. You can go to Mexico tomorrow and get it done. Doesn't work. Save your money and save your health. But otherwise, we can kind of skip to the punchline here and modify our circuitry. So there's a few ways we can actually do this with medications. So we kind of come back to our map here. And there's other ways, there's other pathways that can kind of be workarounds. So that direct cell-to-cell communication that's affected, well, how can we enhance these other bypasses? Kind of build them up. If these are under construction, how can we kind of find the workarounds? And there's actually a few medications that we can do that can help us here. And so we have what's called anticholinergic medications. And to be honest with you, we're not really using these much anymore. Some of you may have heard about these or may know people or even yourself on these. Benztropine, trihexyphenidyl are probably the two most common ones. Why are we not using them? Because of this worsening of cognition, and it may be permanent. So unfortunately with Parkinson's, one of the big other side non-motor problems is having those cognitive impairment, those thinking memory issues that come up as part of the disease. So when you add a medication that can also enhance that, that's not a great combination. So very rarely will we ever use these medications. It can also worsen hallucinations, worsen urinary retention in patients as well. So that's really kind of why these are really fading and not really prescribed very much anymore. You will especially see them, especially in pediatric patients or adolescent patients with kind of weird forms of Parkinson's disease. We might use these more because, again, we're not as worried about having these cognitive effects for you. The other big one that we use way more commonly is the NMDA receptor antagonist, and particularly amantadine. And it has other different formulations. It has some kind of extended release, like once daily options now that are available too. And this is kind of a fun story because basically it's a flu drug that was created initially to help treat flu symptoms. As you guys may become very familiar with COVID and how viruses work, they rapidly mutate. And so whatever drug you make from them, eventually develop immunity and they don't work anymore. So amantadine really does nothing for the flu. But when they made this back in I believe in the 1970s, maybe in the 1980s, this effective for the flu, and some of the doctors noticed, wait a minute, my Parkinson's patients that I give this to, not only is it helping their flu, but it's also helping their Parkinson's symptoms. They're not having as much tremors, they're not having dyskinesia as much. Well, that's interesting. What's going on there? And that's actually how they stumbled upon it. When they gave it to a bunch of people that had the flu, like, wait a minute, our Parkinson's patients are getting better here. And so that's why we use this still to this day, where it can kind of work through those synergistic mechanisms to kind of help improve that signal. Where amantadine really stands out is it's the treatment for dyskinesias. So it can also treat the Parkinson's symptoms, those motor symptoms we talked about with our other meds. But its big difference is it can also treat those dyskinesias. So that's probably where most of the time we're going to use it, is that patients have bothersome dyskinesia, then we will use it. And so I like to kind of talk a little bit about that concept, because I think that's one of the things that's probably one of the biggest misnomers. Dyskinesias look and sound way scarier than they actually are. If you ever have a chance to talk to any person or any individual with dyskinesias, you will hear how little they care about them. Because the bottom line is, the vast majority of the time, that means too much. Guess what? If you have too much medication, you also got enough. And enough feels a lot better than not enough. And many of you might have already been experienced what not enough feels like. That's the walking trouble, that's the tremor, that's the stiffness, that's the slowness. So if you got a little bit extra movement, yeah, so be it. Because I can still do all the movements I want to do, I just have a little extra. Versus off state, I can't do the movements I want to do. So over 90% of the time, patients would choose to have the dyskinesias versus lowering down the medications and off. And I want to tell her to this room, I don't see anyone having dyskinesias yet, because again, they look really bad. When the patients actually start having like, oh, this is all that was. And interestingly enough, for your caregivers, you're probably going to notice it first because the patients don't care about it. They don't interfere, the vast majority of them. Again, we talked about like a young patient who was on the international news broadcasts and things, so that it does depend. Bad is bad. So eventually at some point, most patients will have it. They're really severe and it can be bothersome. Or depending on what you're trying to do. Yes, if you're like on a news broadcast every night and you're kind of sitting there doing this all the time, you might care way more about that than someone else. So that's one thing about dyskinesias, is I like to kind of get out in front of that, because that's something that I learned as a provider. When I started working with Parkinson's patients, I had patient after patient tell me, this dyskinesia means things like that. So I had to kind of share that with everybody, because I get and kind of see the picture of Michael J. Fox, like, that's the last thing that I want. Give me any medication that doesn't do that. So I just want to kind of put that kind of announcement out there. It's like, hey, we're not so bad, and they're reversible. So if you ever got dyskinesias that are really bad, you can back down the medications and they'll get better. But amantadine is one of those times where it's like you start getting those bothersome dyskinesias. This is one way that we can try to help kind of curb that for you. Yeah. So why don't we use amantadine all the time? Well, it actually kind of has a similar effect to some of those anticholinergic medications we just talked about, where if you have dementia, you have bad cognitive impairment, or having hallucinations, it can worsen that too. So for most patients, they can be on amantadine for a while. And then when they get in those later stages of the disease, if they start having those non-motor symptoms, then we might need to lower this or think about alternatives. The other thing it can do is cause this lacy skin rash, which is really harmless. It's called livedo reticularis. But obviously it can be pretty cosmetically disfiguring. And for a lot of people, they're not happy when they get something like this, and that's reversible too. Another reason why you'd have to potentially lower down stop the medication. And the kind of the newer kid on the block is Neurians, and this is another one that works with those kind of bypass systems, working kind of in synergy around those dopamine direct circuits. And actually, it works on a receptor called adenosine. How was this discovered? Because they figured out, hey, patients that drink caffeine don't seem to get Parkinson's as much as patients that do. So they basically made a drug that kind of works the same way caffeine does within the neurological system. And so it's kind of an interesting one because it actually got approved in Japan like over a decade ago. And then the more recently got approved here in the US. Part of that is because it's not a home inhibitor. We're talking kind of mild benefits. This is one that, again, that we've been talking about with CNLT inhibitors, like in Comtan, that we talked about the sledgeling or saddling, those MAOs. These are those fine tuners. These are the ones that maybe help a little bit around the edges, but they're not going to be the big guns. They're not going to be the levodopa that does the majority of the work. So again, they kind of estimate maybe 45 minutes and 90 minutes, kind of less off time for the whole day. So you think to yourself, kind of 15 to 30 minutes around each dose per se, to kind of reduce that wearing off effect. Its side effects are basically the same as like getting too much levodopa. It can cause lightheadedness, it can cause an upset stomach, and it can cause a dyskinesias. But probably not as potently comparatively to doing the levodopa in foods. So kind of the same principle we just talked about with the others. Hey, I might not want to make such a big adjustment. I want to fine tune the sleep in that window. So that's where we would potentially use this. The other nice part about it too, it's once a day. So that's a nice thing. Again, why would we not use it more? Because it tends to be more expensive and then pretty much everything we talked at this point, as far as those fine tuning medications. So a lot of its little use has to do with just a pragmatic, practical approach. But again, for a lot of insurance formularies, if you tried a lot of these other medications, most of the time you can get this covered. And then it's just a matter of seeing, is that enough of a benefit to be worth continuing on? But same thing as all the others, side effects are reversible. And unfortunately, it does not give that same caffeine stimulation boost. It doesn't give the energy boost that caffeine does. And that's a popular question, but yeah, because it works kind of mechanistically directly within the nervous system, not the way that caffeine works in the rest of the body. Here's my two doggos. But any questions so far about meds before we transition? Yeah.
I'm not sure for patients that are taking covered up with levodopa and still have tremor. What medication is to be added to that?
Yeah, so in that case, to be honest with you, a lot of medications may not work. So he's asking if tremors are a problem and not responding to levodopa, what you could do. So sometimes you might try something like amantadine, would be an example where you try to get potentially a different medication. Some of it might be, okay, like why is the levodopa not working? It's because we haven't given enough of a trial. But again, sometimes you'll double, triple the levodopa and not see the response you're looking for. And probably the most common thing, the next thing we're kind of thinking that algorithm, especially if it's tremor, is deep brain stimulation. That's one of the ones that we'll definitely kind of jump to in that case, because that one has an indication where it can work a lot better for tremor compared to the medications. But if you're not a deep brain stimulation candidate, then there are potentially some other medication adjustments that we can make with a lot of the ones we talked about here.
What is the typical workup time to develop? How best the patient needs a specific med of carbidopa? Is it a 1 year workup?
What do you mean by workup? Like how long you're on it?
Time you're first diagnosed,
when you would start a medication, you mean?
Right, and know what works best for you.
Yeah, so that's a kind of two-part question. Yeah, so what you asked is like, how long does it take to kind of like before you would start a medication, and how long do you know before you kind of optimize your medications? When you actually start a medication is 100% based upon what symptoms and what goals you're trying to get out of it. So that's a very individualized approach. There's not like it's not like blood pressure. It's like, well, if you don't do this, you're paying a price down the road. This is 100% upfront. I have this thing that are bothering my quality of life now. What do you have that can help improve that? Right here today. So that's how these medications work. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in more detail. When is it optimized? The answer is never. It's a lifelong process. You will definitely get into grooves where things will actually be working, and some patients can stay in those grooves for years. They get on a dose and it just works for them. Yeah. Other patients will always have to kind of tinker, and that's just unfortunately the difference is that patients sum up nicely. Parkinson's patients are snowflakes, know exactly what they're like. And one of those parts is how they respond to medication. So the only way you'll know that is with time. And again, it becomes a little bit more straightforward. What do you need to do is basically like, what bothers me? What are those symptoms that are interfering? That's what you're talking about with your providers, because that's what you're taking medications to help. What are those things that are actually annoying you? So we talked a little bit about dyskinesia. There's one example, tremors, another example. I've had patients flopping out of their seats and they could care less. I've had other patients where I need to get out the magnifying glass to see their tremor, and it's a big deal. So that's 100% person to person. What are those things that are bothering you dictates how aggressively and how often you might need to change the treatment. Yeah. But inevitably, the disease moves. Inevitably, the symptoms will change. How quickly it changes is pretty variable. Yeah. But inevitably, there's always going to be that check-in. Always like, how am I doing on the medications? Do what I want them to do, or do I need to adjust them? So that's what I mean by that. Never is it going to be like set and forget it. That's only going to be transient until eventually at some point we probably have to make an adjustment. Any other questions? But we're going to talk a little bit more about that in detail about the approach. Now that we've kind of talked about what we have, now the second part of this is going to be like why we would choose, and kind of trying to arm you guys with a way to kind of approach that, your best advocates for making your medication right in the best that you do. All right, so let's jump in on that. So here's our list, and here's me down over here being like, oh crap, what do I do? And this is like me like going to the Cheesecake Factory, and I'm like, oh God, what do I pick off the menu? And that's, again, this is where we'll spend a lot of time kind of thinking about this, like, what is that personalized approach? This is why I love taking care of Parkinson's patients, because every single one of my decisions is collaborative. It's not just like, oh, like you had a blood test, here's this medication, we'll see you next month. It's let's look at you, let's talk about what you care about, let's talk about what you're trying to accomplish, and then let's tailor our treatments accordingly. And fact check that. That's kind of like the rinse, wash, and repeat. So again, a couple of key things that I want to arm you guys with in terms of what we would do. We just talked about this, but I can't say it enough. Parkinson's treatment outside of exercise is symptomatic relief. That means there's never have to. There's never, oh, if I don't take this, I make my disease worse. Oh, if I take this, my disease is better in 5 years. No, it's helping you today with the symptoms that bother you. So if you're ever in a situation where you're like, I have some tremor, but taking a pill every day is more annoying than the tremor is, why the heck are you taking a pill every day? If you're falling 5 times a day, well, then we should be talking about getting on medications to stop the falls. So 100%, it's all based upon symptomatic relief. I had another provider describe it nicely. We got really good cough drops for you. We don't have the antibiotics that cures the strep throat that causes the cough, but we can certainly take the edge off the cough that bothers you. And that's what we're doing with these medications. So these are always driven by what are those symptoms that bother you, okay? Essentially, all the side effects are reversible. We talked about that already, but it's a key point. Feel comfortable and confident trying the medications out. Don't suffer until they're just kind of like, well, I'll wait until I'm in a wheelchair, then I'll take it. Well, then you miss all those years where you could have benefited from the medication before you end up in the wheelchair. So the idea here is like, if you got anything to bit off more than you can chew, you can walk that back. There's no one way to treat Parkinson's, and there's potentially multiple right answers. So that's the beautiful part about this. And there's the kind of science and art. We just talked about that big menu and the different medications and how they can work. If you were to put 50 of us like movement experts in a room, we might come up with 50 different regimens for you, but guess what? All 50 could be right. So that's the beautiful part about this, is it's not just, oh, well, I better stick, there's only one thing, and if this doesn't work, then it absolutely fails. A lot of potential right answers here. A lot of different ways that we can kind of craft something that works for you or troubleshoot something that isn't working for you. So the other part that I hear a lot from patients, I don't want to take that. Why not? Because if that doesn't work, I'm out of ideas. I always want to have that reassurance that there's something else. Guess what? There always is. There's always something else. So again, don't leave it on the shelf just out of that fear of like, I'm burning through all my options. Okay? And then the last part is that shared decision-making is an absolute must. I can't read your minds. I wish I could. That'd be kind of cool. I wouldn't be here giving this talk here today, but certainly this is important for you guys to come to me or come to your providers with what bothers you. Maybe say, I don't know, doc, whatever you want to do. Well, I'm going to back you and say, well, what's bothering you? What do I need to fix? What's the problem that's in front of us? Parkinson's by itself does not necessarily need symptomatic treatment. Okay, that's your exercise. All right, that's the only thing that I'm going to tell you is non-negotiable. Everything else is, well, what's bothering you? Here's a treatment for that. Does that seem reasonable to you? If it sounds worse than the actual symptom, what are we doing? Let's wait. Let's see if that ever becomes a problem. Okay? So that's important for you guys to be advocates, caregivers to be advocates. Kind of think about that before you see your providers. What are those bothersome things? What are those things that I'm going to my provider to address? Yeah, when you go to your primary care, they check your blood pressure and then yell at you and say your blood pressure is not normal and they throw a pill at you. That's not how this works. This is going to be what are those things on a daily basis? How is Parkinson's interfering? We need to hear that from you. We might not even get to see it when you come to see us. So we need that kind of that information to basically tailor your treatments to you. So again, shared decision making. So this is pretty much what we do. Discuss what's going on, get our concerns organized, go through our options, make a decision, see which one kind of fits the best, and then we follow up to see if that's a success or a failure, and then we rinse, wash, and repeat. And this will kind of give you some scenarios here. I already highlighted a couple of these, but this is kind of outlining this. So these are actually two direct patients that I had, 67-year-old avid skier, tennis player, and it came in and was really bothered by his tremors, his Parkinsonism, because he was having a hard time doing those activities. So honestly, when we talked through those different options, he wasn't so concerned about having dyskinesias or other side effects. He's like, give me the stuff that's going to let me do those things. I want to be able to keep skiing. I want to be able to keep beating the crap out of everybody at my tennis club. Let's get to the point. Let's get to the punchline and get on the good stuff right off the bat. And so that's what we did. That 37-year-old is the one I already mentioned. She was the one getting on international news broadcasts. And so certainly for her, those frequent public appearances, she was very concerned about dyskinesias. In fact, one of her more embarrassing moments was that when like basically all the commentary on the YouTube channel was like, what's wrong with her? Like, give that girl a drug test, all those kinds of things. So that was particularly embarrassing for her. So for her, we kind of eased in. We started off on the rescheduling and the amantadine kind of solo, and we eased in and waited before the symptoms became more problematic. She eventually retired from doing that gig, and then we started her on the levodopa at that point. So again, different approaches. And to give you a rough idea, 60% of patients will kind of graduate from this kind of like nickel and dime stage of kind of like, yeah, symptoms aren't so bad. In 2 to 3 years, we're probably getting to this point of getting on levodopa. Symptoms will probably get problematic enough, we'll get there. So more to highlight that, hey, even if you say that you're not going to do it at the start, it's outdoors all the way. And that's what we do. So for some patients, we kind of ease into it. For others, why are we messing around? If we're going to do it, let's get on the stuff that's going to work, because the demand I have for this is not just every day around the house. I want to be able to do those kind of big time activities and be as normal as possible. So this is an example of having that kind of personalized discussion to be like, well, what's right? What do you care about? What's good for you? And again, remember the other key point there is we're always monitoring the success of them. If you're getting side effects that are more bothersome than the benefit, then why the heck are we continuing that treatment for? Just to kind of briefly highlight too, this is a whole nother talk. But again, we talked about at the beginning all these non-motor symptoms. Here's just a brief list of the different things we could try. This would actually kind of go all the way down here and all into the back of the room in terms of all the medications. More as the highlight, these go to the list too as far as what bothers me. Is it constipation? Is it urinary troubles? Is it thinking memory issues? Is it postnasal drip? All the things that could be a part of Parkinson's that we can actually fix. So if you're not sure, my best advice is ask your providers and be like, is this related to my Parkinson's? Is this something that we talk about with you, or is this something we talk about with somebody else? I love that question. Is this like postnasal drip is probably the classic example? Like no one would logically think, oh yeah, definitely that's my Parkinson's, no doubt about it. Even most providers outside of the neurologist would be like, well, that's not Parkinson's. Yeah, but it is. Yeah. And so those are things that we can potentially help you with too, not just the motor symptoms. So that's just kind of a plug. This would be a whole nother separate talk to get into the nitty-gritty on this. So now I want to kind of talk a little bit about, I kind of mentioned this before, about advanced Parkinson's. I think this is like somewhat of a confusing topic, and especially one to kind of be like, well, okay, I'm sitting here in this room. I don't have a neurologist, or I don't have a movement disorder expert. When is it time to go to see them? When is it time? When does it become complex enough that I need to see an expert? It's when you reach this. And again, there's different ways that we've kind of defined advanced Parkinson's, and I want to kind of talk a little bit about those. So many of you may have heard about these Hone and Yar stages. And Margaret Hone actually was a physician here at CU when she discovered this back in the 70s. And again, this is before we really had all these treatments. So if you're kind of treatment naive, don't have other medications, don't have a lot of the other advanced knowledge we have, kind of starts off on one side of the body, both sides, starts impairing balance. Now you need to use walking sticks, canes, walkers, and then you end up in a wheelchair. So that's stage 1 through 5. This is very individual. There's really no guarantee. It's not like, oh, 2 years here, 2 years here. This is not like stage 4 cancer or those kinds of things. This is incredibly variable. Some patients, especially the trauma predominant ones, have very minimal to no walking troubles throughout the course of their disease. So they'll never reach these, even though they all have Parkinson's. So to be honest with you, this doesn't really hold up much. And so we get a lot of questions about what stage am I in. It's great for research studies because in general, if you have all of you in the room, I'm trying to do a study on more advanced patients. Well, if I say if you're over here, odds are I'm catching more of you further in the disease course. If I'm saying I don't want those, I want to make sure you're not having those issues, I'm more likely to get you kind of early in the disease course. But you as an individual, the stage really doesn't matter. You kind of know if you're walking independently or not at stage. Okay. So I think that's sometimes confusing for a lot of patients about that, especially if you read the research. It says, oh, it's done in stage 3 Parkinson's patients. Like, what stage am I? And so that doesn't really hold up in terms of using the individual. So what do we kind of more use these days is the modern definition is when you start entering those motor fluctuations that we talked about before. When my treatment's working, I feel great, and I can tell the difference and lose function when it's not. On versus off is the other way you hear about. So they actually did a study in Australia, and at 20 years, 100% of their patients had fluctuations. The average is about 5 to 7. The earliest you might see that is somewhere around 2 years. So there's a wide range of when you get into that. But again, 5 to 7 years is when you kind of reach that spot of like, I can't get away with anything anymore. Now when medications are not optimal, I lose function. So that's what we kind of refer to as that advanced Parkinson's stage. My fluctuations are now problematic. So what can we kind of do, and then what are some of those terms to be familiar with? Again, we talked about on. On refers medications are on working, I feel good. Off is when those symptoms are suboptimally controlled. So that would be like not having anything in your system. And then we have also peak dose side effects from too much. Those are like your dyskinesias where you got too much medication. So kind of like in the sweet spot, too little or too much is kind of how we think about it. And so again, there's many different types of off periods that patients will experience. You can kind of see some examples here. Again, getting into the nitty gritty of this will be like a whole separate talk. When we get to more of those advanced stages. But there's a lot of these different vernacular we might kind of see or described in different Parkinson's literature about this. And all these things are things that we'll ask you about. But if you start to notice basically that you're having these, or if someone asks you, I can tell you my on is, I can tell you my off are, I can tell you what I have those peak dose side effects. For a lot of patients, a lot of people you can set your watch to it as long as you're taking medications consistently. So that's step 1. You start having this, you better make sure you're locking down in terms of that regimen. So you can get sloppy at the start because everything can kind of work. When this stage starts happening, that's when you really want to make sure you develop that good habit or that you work on developing it. Because if you get that clockwork down with your medications, meaning the spacing between the doses is the same every day, that your food intake is not interfering, then you can really set your watch to when am I on, when am I off, when am I having too much. You take that information to your doctor. That makes our jobs really easy to figure out where those cracks are and decide, hey, which medications that we just talked about today can help fill that bit? Are you just kind of wearing off a little bit around each dose? Are you wearing off hours before the next dose? Are you spending most of your time with these peak dose side effects that are bothersome to you? All those things will have a different course of action in that. So again, not to scare you too much if you're not having these things, because again, if you're in good habits now, if you've already nailed down that approach of like, yeah, I'm gonna take my meds every 4 hours, every 5 hours, I'm pretty good about that. It does not have to be the same time every day, because you're gonna wake up different times, where the spacing between the doses is pretty reliable. You're not gonna even notice these things for years, versus your counterpart that's taking the medication willy-nilly every day is different, missing doses. They're gonna pick up on this period a lot faster. So this is the time, if you're not here yet, to get in those good habits. And when this comes, that's when you see a movement disorder expert. That's when you don't see a neurologist. That's when you see a movement disorder specialist. Because all these other things where we talked a little bit about the medications, everything else, there's so many different choices. This is what we spent an extra couple of years in fellowship learning about, how to battle this advanced stage of the disease. So this is when you want to bring this on board to your team if we're not on board already. They have that conversation, what makes sense. Do you have a question, Lydia?
Yeah, there's a question from online. The question is, most of my symptoms are in my head, loss of smell.
So the first part of the question is, most of my symptoms are in my head. Yeah, I hate to say
Yeah.
that. That's where Parkinson's happens. Yeah.
Okay. So, bear with me.
And also for you guys, if anyone
My
wants to
most
get up, walk around.
troublesome symptoms are in my head, loss of sense of smell and speech difficulties. Are there medications for those?
Great question, and not really the purview of today's talk to talk about like the non-motor symptoms. Definitely if you're having speech issues, the number one most important thing to do is see a speech therapist, a speech pathologist, to talk to your provider about that. Number two, the other one they mentioned was hyposmia or loss of smell. There is no treatment for that. Yeah. So that's just one where if it's related to things like COVID and those kinds of things, and many of you may have experienced, it comes back. But for Parkinson's, it often won't. So the number one thing is diet, because your food won't taste the same and the smell changes. So you might have to kind of mix it up a little bit, spice up your food, try some new things. Now, there's no medication that brings it back. All right. So again, these are the things to kind of watch out for. And this is kind of just hammering that point about the bad habits, kind of reminding ourselves about those good habits, taking the meds consistently, getting kind of comfortable with most days on the kind of time my meals around my meds, so I'm kind of consistent with that. Life happens. Some days will be different. That's okay. That's perfectly fine. The idea is that on most days, you're kind of hitting the marks. You're getting not close to the right time. And again, what's the bottom line principle? If you have to dig yourself out of the pothole versus not going into it to begin with, you need a very different amount of medication to help you out. Because if you bury yourself deep and try to build yourself out, you need a lot more than if you just stop yourself from going downhill at the beginning. And again, this is what we talked about in terms of the kind of just hammering that point about that adjustment. If you're asking about earlier, that as this window narrows, this is why we're going to eventually have to make an adjustment to the treatment. This is why it's never like, oh, it takes a year and I'm on the medication regimen for life. Because unfortunately, these windows are narrowing over time no matter what we do. What keeps these windows broad and big? Exercise. So what can you do for motor fluctuations? Again, these are hypothetical. You know, we can make medication adjustments. We can add more doses. We can use other medications to reduce those off periods like we talked about. We can use amantadine to help with dyskinesias. We can use those other long-acting versions of levodopa, like the feeding tube ones, or the extended release medications. If you're having those like off periods where I lose function, man, I hit the wall. I don't have the luxury of waiting a half an hour to fix that. Again, we can use that inhaled version of levodopa or other rescue doses to kind of get you that jump start and get back up and running. Because every day is a little bit different with Parkinson's, so sometimes you'll have some unpredictability for those off periods. And that's where sometimes having those rescue medications is nice. Yeah, most of the days, 13 out of 14 days, my baseline regimen works. On that 14th day, I hit the wall. Or I do my water Zumba class like once every couple of weeks. And man, when I do that, I really hit the wall. So I need a little booster to get myself through that. And the idea, if you're ever using rescue doses, if you're using the rescue dose several times a day, what does that tell us? Your baseline regimen ain't right. That needs to be adjusted too. So sometimes that's not a bad way to back check your baseline regimen as well. And again, these would be things that just kind of remember, these are tools in the toolkit for if you're not having those problems yet and you develop them, we have some solutions to work on. And then the interventional treatments, I kind of put the, so what happens when you end up rocking a hard place? That's when we start thinking about these other treatments, like these interventions. And probably the big one is deep brain stimulation. I want to finish up this kind of briefly introducing this. So again, you see basically you'll have the wires put in the head here, and they connect down to a pacemaker in the chest. This is basically the same technology as a cardiac pacemaker for your heart. And it's sending an electrical signal into the brain to kind of modify that circuitry like we talked about. Been around for a while, especially for Parkinson's, even in the US, it's been approved since 2002. So you've already had over 100,000 of patients that have this, for various conditions, especially a big chunk of that is Parkinson's. So we really it's kind of a one that we're familiar with. And again, here's our problem. So once we start kind of reaching this stage where we're having these fluctuations, this advanced stage of the disease, this is when we start thinking about surgical options and advanced treatments. This is when our medications are kind of failing us because we're having a hard time using that medication to keep it within that window. So this is when we need these other options potentially to help us out. So again, why you need to have a movement disorder expert as part of your team to kind of talk about these things. Is it time for me to start thinking about things like deep brain stimulation? Now, reasons to get, it can help reduce the medication burden. So especially if you're having side effect problems, it can help you with that. If you're having those bothersome dyskinesias and the antidene's not taking care of it, if you're having those troubling off times, or again, it's like, I don't have the luxury of letting myself go off. Because if I do, I can't really function very well. So I got to do whatever I can to prevent that from happening. And then we talked about earlier, the tremors in particular, is if that's the stickler, if that's a symptom not responding, and this is potentially a good treatment for you. And then worsening of the motor symptoms despite the medication. So ours just kind of keep progressing. Key thing to keep in mind here, it's easy sometimes to think, oh, surgery, that's going to do better than my meds. No. It reproduces the best response you get from your meds, with the exception of tremors. So all the rest of the response that you get from your meds, the deep brain stimulation basically can reproduce that and keep it more stable for you. So it keeps you in that sweet spot. It's keeping you in between here. It's not going to uncover some unforeseen benefit. So that's another key thing to keep in mind. The one exception is tremors. Tremors are the one where it's like, oh, my meds just don't really touch this. Deep brain stimulation might be your fix for them. That's probably one of the most common misnomers that we get referrals, even from other neurologists, or even sometimes patients unfortunately go directly to neurosurgeons and get surgery, but not realizing that, hey, it's not going to treat symptoms that the medications aren't. It's going to basically keep that consistency of that good response that you get. Okay. Other things that it's not good for, it can worsen memory. So that's probably one of the biggest things that we screen for ahead of time. And all these other kind of non-motor symptoms really aren't going to respond. So you would certainly not do deep brain stimulation because you're having issues with any of these non-motor symptoms. Okay? It's for the motor symptoms like we've kind of been talking about all day today in that same boat. So again, just to highlight, what does it kind of do differently that levodopa doesn't do? Tremors. That's where DBS can kind of jump in. Then the contrary indications, we kind of already hinted a little bit. If you got dementia, probably no bueno. And the reason why is like if you worsen that function, who cares if your tremor's better? Because you can't even function in your daily life. Other parts would be like this, it's surgery. So if you have other surgical contraindications, that could be problematic. And probably this is the one I hate more than anything, unrealistic expectations. Because that basically means you went to probably got your surgery done by someone that didn't talk you through. You got brain surgery done with not understanding the risk and benefit. So I encourage you 100%. This is why we do a preoperative thorough evaluation. This is why at our center and centers across the country, especially these Parkinson's disease centers of excellence, what's the standard? Multidisciplinary care approach, where we make sure that you guys as individuals understand what you're signing up for before you get brain surgery. To really get, this is why I would and why I wouldn't do it. This is what I can expect to get better. This is what won't get better. Saddest thing ever, we're a tertiary care center, meaning that patients from all across the geographical area will come to see us when it doesn't work. So we get DBS patients from all over the place that come in. It's like, I'm here because I need you to make my walking better. You guys won't make the walking better. And it's like, well, why did I get the surgery? Those are some of the saddest conversations we have about this. So number one, most important thing, this is why you get in to see a Parkinson's expert to have that conversation. If you ever are getting surgery, I put a plug, go to a center of excellence, go to a center that has a multidisciplinary approach. So you feel comfortable being like, I know the X's and Y's, I know the ins and outs, I know the risk and benefit. This still makes sense for me to do it. Okay?
What's the alternative to DBS? There's one treatment that you go in and burn movement center. It's irreversible.
Yeah, so we're talking about focus ultrasound. Yeah, so he's asking about the alternatives for DBS, and he's mentioned about focus ultrasound.
Yes.
So that one's kind of a little bit too soon, with the exception of maybe tremors. So tremors could be potentially an option. And again, most centers of excellence, like ours included for here for Colorado, we do all the above. So we would take that into consideration about which type would be. The current data, there's like a 30% failure rate if you're trying to go after for Parkinson's symptoms. And like you said, it's burning a permanent hole in your brain.
Right.
And you have a third chance that it's not going to work. So there's probably some nuance to be worked out in terms of like its effectiveness or the other symptoms of Parkinson's. So stay tuned. Yeah, but I would definitely like consult for most of my patients, unless it's tremors, focus ultrasound for Parkinson's, not quite there yet. You might know other people or even been diagnosed yourselves with things like a central tremor. Now, that one is a little more reliable because, again, when you're dealing with just that tremor symptom, actually a focus ultrasound can be pretty effective. Some of that might be a target, and there's a lot of other nuances to kind of figure it out. And again, like we talked about this one, deep brain stimulation, been doing this for 30 years now. Focused ultrasound, less than a decade. So again, sometimes it's not a bad idea not to be getting paid for brain surgery. Yeah. But 100% for most of our patients, we take that into consideration. What are those pluses and minuses of getting one versus the other? There are like very nuanced situations like we've been talking about today. Every Parkinson's patient is a little bit different, a little unique. So some of those other nuances might matter. And so what's the bottom line takeaway? That's why you go see that expert care. Kind of be like, well, where do I fit? Is this a good option for me?
Yeah, I looked at it for the tremor, and fortunately the medication is working. And
Yeah.
it's a simple, but it kind of scared me. The focused ultrasound is permanent, it's irreversible, and darn, it's just like,
Yeah.
So I didn't go that route.
Yeah, so he's mentioning about like how taking medications versus doing a surgical procedure. One big part of that is like, yeah, there better be something that's going on in your life that you need brain surgery for. And focused ultrasound is burning a permanent hole in the brain. And so I certainly kind of put it in that same boat where it's like, it better not just be like a what if or yeah, why not?
Right.
There better be something that's significant to be like, well, I'm not going to take a pill. I'm going to get some wires put in my head or a permanent hole burned in my head. Yeah. And so that's usually why we kind of make sure that it's more of those advanced stages, more medication trials have already been done and have not worked for some reason. And that's when we start thinking about these. Because you will hear a lot of different approaches, a lot of different aggressive advertisements out there. So I just encourage you, be your best advocates. Talk to the experts about that. Make sure it's not a bad idea sometimes to get a second opinion if you're still unsure. But I think the biggest difference that we kind of see in terms of landscape, the reason why we kind of centers of excellence, why do we call it the standard of care, is to make sure that all of us, the neurosurgeons, the neurologists, the neuropsychiatrists, that check your thinking and memory to make sure that it's not going to be problematic. We all sit in a room, directly talk to each other because we want to be sure that we're getting it right. We're not missing something. But there's plenty of places that don't use that same standard of care. And they're there basically to be like, if you want me to put wires in your head, I'll do it. So make sure you're your own advocates with that. Yeah, and I think here you go. Here's our kind of like what I would recommend as being the standard of care for any kind of deep brain stimulation, and focused ultrasound would be right in that same kind of conversation. So when if you guys are ever thinking about those things, this is that time to go see an expert care center. And I think, we're getting pretty close to up to it. So I got more details, but again, I don't want to get bogged down with details of deep brain stimulation because that's a whole separate talk. And again, the key thing today was really to highlight the medication treatments and really set the stage to be like, hey, when you reach those advanced stages, these are the things that also enter into the mix in addition to those medication adjustments that we talked about.
One of the good things with deep brain stimulation, you can dial it, you can adjust it, you can, so it's not one size fits all. You can do DBS and you can, maybe, I thought that's the way it worked.
Yeah, 100%. And again, there's usually always going to be great talks. And I encourage you guys to, if you go to cumovement.org or Parkinson's Disease Foundation, Michael J. Fox, they have great videos talking about a lot of these surgical treatments. Just never too soon to arm yourself with information about it. But absolutely, I think they also do a really good job talking a little bit about like, what is the process? What does it actually look like? Which of course matters a lot more when you're kind of like really thinking, like your doctors are telling you, hey, this might be an option to kind of help with your symptoms. Definitely do your homework on that. And there's great resources out there now that are available. And for our center, we even have patient advocates that have gone through the process and talk a little bit about what that's like. And what is it like when we kind of have a troubleshoot? Like his question or comment was more about the adjustability of the deep brain stimulation. And really mirrors everything we talked about today. When you make medications and you adjust them, you check your work, and then you make more adjustments if it was a success or failure. The deep brain stimulation kind of works in a very similar vein, and you adjust it almost like you would your medications.
One of the questions we have from online, and we might be talking about this later, is the light studies that are being done. And my guess is she's talking about the red light therapy.
Yeah, so there's a lot of, so the light therapy, basically the whole point of this is like, red light is not as popular, but there's other ones being looked at. Essentially, it's just like you kind of like have like a bright light on while you're kind of doing whatever other activities. And they're wondering about if there's kind of some fascinating ways that our brains work with our interaction with light and how it can kind of set our circadian rhythms and these kinds of things. And so there's been a lot of interest and attention to be like, is there a way to harness that? Like be deliberate about when you're kind of exposing your brain to light and how that can kind of help smooth out a bunch of different activities in our brains. So Parkinson's is certainly no exception to that. It's actually gotten a lot of attention. A lot of nuance to be worked out in terms of best practices. And so there's a study that we're going to be doing at our center. If anyone's interested, reach out about that. My practical piece of advice, if anyone's trying to sell you equipment that's really expensive for light therapy, don't do it. To be honest with you, if you walked outside and looked at the bright sunlight for an hour a day, it probably accomplishes the same thing. So that would be kind of my acknowledgement for that. But stay tuned because they're trying to kind of delve down a little bit more to be like, well, how much? And is there certain wavelengths like red light and other things that could be of interest? But there's a lot of kind of snake oil salesmen out there too with the light therapy. So just be cautious if anyone's saying like spend $10,000 in this machine. There's no evidence to back that up yet. But what's the bottom line? Living in Colorado isn't half bad because we get 300 days of sunshine.
I've got one more quick question.
Absolutely.
Those windows that you showed the progression, there were no timelines on those. And you said exercise can extend a window. I mean, exercise is a pretty broad term. I mean, is it aerobic? Is it, I mean.
So the shorting, so what he's asking about is like, how does exercise kind of fit into all this? If I'm not mistaken, that's part 3.
Yeah, that's our whole third session. Is
So you're gonna get a whole like hour to 2 hours on that. Choose the nuance. What's the short answer? Is it all works?
It's all good.
Yeah. So what is kind of like the basic principle? What's my takeaway from most of my patients? What's rule number 1? Find something that you're gonna do. Because if you're making up 10 million excuses to not do it, why do you keep saying that you're going to?
Right.
We're all humans. We can all catch ourselves when an exercise bike collects dust in our living room every year. Like this year, I'm going to do it. Well, if it's been 5 years, try something different. What's beautiful, PAR has such great resources for that. You don't even have to go past looking at their website for a bunch of great exercise classes. The online classes that are available through the Parkinson's Foundation, or even if you just pull up YouTube. What's rule number 2? Be safe. So if you're trying to do like ladder jumping from one ladder to another, well, I'd encourage you, patient Parkinson's, not to do that. But as long as you're being safe about it, it all works. And again, you're going to hear probably a lot more detail about it going beyond. But again, if you forgot everything I said and walked out here being like exercise, then yeah, I think that's not a bad place to start. Other questions?
Yeah, I heard that my theory might be coming off patent soon.
maybe, but yeah, well, who knows? Probably not for a while, And the reason why it's getting this scattering is because that's the same company that's making our Atari 2.0 that Crexon. But, usually I hate to tell you, for the most part, when a drug company comes out with a new medication, you think, oh, well, they'll make the other one cheaper. No, they just make them both the same, more expensive price. Hate to tell you, that's kind of how it works, but eventually, at some point, it will, and probably when it does, we'll be using a lot earlier in the disease course. Because having more of an extended release option is nice to kind of stay out and avoid those fluctuations, maybe actually get it down at twice-a-day dosing, these kinds of things at the start. So stay tuned for that. But unfortunately, that's more of a price issue than anything. Right now, roughly, it could cost you about $1,000 out of pocket to just jump straight into it.
My insurance,
Yeah, or your insurance will just flat out deny until you try the other stuff. But again, the good news is for the most part, in that honeymoon period for those first several years, the Cinemet, the dirt cheap medication works just fine. And that's what we keep finding. It's like, yeah, there's probably no reason to have to spend hundreds of dollars a month until you actually start running into those problems. And again, hopefully in sometime in the near future, we'll have even other options available. Other questions? Perfect. I'll kind of hang up here if anyone has other questions offline, but thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.